Close your eyes. We're traveling back to 3000 BCE. The ground is cracked, the heat unbearable. Bare footsteps echo in a temple on the outskirts of the city of Uruk. Inside, dozens of people kneel, holding the remains of sacrificed animals. The smoke in the air is not just incense, there is something else, fear. A figure leads the ceremony, wearing a mask made of animal hide, with painted eyes, whispering an unknown incantation. This person is a shaman. And the people before them are slaves. This isn't just a religious ritual of sacrifice. This is the rite of soul surrender. These slaves were surrendered not only with their bodies but with their souls. This video opens a world to you that is not even mentioned in history books. In ancient Mesopotamia, a secret bond between shamans and slaves, forbidden rituals, and a belief system based on exploiting the human soul. Some of this was never officially recorded. Because it was forbidden. It had to be hidden. So why were these forbidden rituals performed only on slaves? Why did shamans offer the souls of others to the gods, and not their own? And why do some excavations find magical seals next to the bodies of sacrificed slaves? In this video, we're embarking on a journey into the dark secrets of ancient Mesopotamia. If you're ready, let's begin. Mesopotamian civilizations, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, were some of the earliest slave societies in human history. However, in these societies, slavery was not just an economic or social concept. The slave was not merely labor but a spiritual tool. Sumerian tablets mention terms like Nam Lugal and Nam Aran, which defined a person's status and spiritual destiny. Slaves were indebted not only to their masters but also to the gods. This belief created a foundation for their use in ceremonial practices. Some inscriptions, particularly those from the cities of Nippur and Ur, refer to secret houses. This term has not been scientifically clarified, but some archaeologists suggest it refers to illegal or mysterious ritual spaces outside the main temples. In these secret houses, young slaves were often used. Archaeological finds from buried sacrificial sites, including figurines, stone tablets carved with mysterious symbols, and obsidian tools found alongside bones, indicate that the events here were not ordinary worship. Furthermore, it was believed in Mesopotamia that spirits called Giddim could remain in the world after death. Therefore, some shamans tried to release these spirits through the deaths of slaves, using them as a source of energy. Terms like Giddim meal and soul trap, found in some sources, serve as weak evidence for these dark practices. At this point, the slave becomes not just a sacrifice but a tool, a door, a key. Shamans used these spirits to communicate with the gods or to get prophecies about the future. And now we come to the real question: were these rituals truly dedicated to the gods, or were they merely the shamans' attempts to increase their own power? The answer to this question will soon take you to the heart of the shaman figure in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the term shaman was not used directly, but there were spiritual figures with similar functions: the Ashipu, sorcerer healer, and the Mashmashu, ritual expert. These figures were not just people who treated illnesses but intermediaries believed to communicate with the gods. And now we come to the real question: were these rituals truly dedicated to the gods, or were they merely the shamans' attempts to increase their own power? The answer to this question will soon take you to the heart of the shaman figure in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the term shaman was not used directly, but there were spiritual figures with similar functions: the Ashipu, sorcerer healer, and the Mashmashu, ritual expert. These figures were not just people who treated illnesses but intermediaries believed to communicate with the gods. The Ashipu was tasked with warding off malevolent spirits. But they were also known as individuals who could make pacts with these spirits, extract information from them, and even redirect a spirit to another person. Some prayers on tablets state that the Ashipu would control a spirit with salt, blood, and tobacco. These are symbols still used today in some traditional shamanic practices. The Mashmashu, on the other hand, was usually a temple shaman. Their duty was to maintain divine order, perform rites, and provide prophecies to kings. However, some sources also refer to them as individuals who managed secret rituals. The dual symbols found on kuduru stones, which most people cannot interpret, are sometimes seen as secret languages belonging to these individuals. Archaeologists suggest that the blood basin and obsidian mirror found in a structure unearthed in Uruk may have been used not only for ritual cleansing but also for transitioning between dimensions and summoning spirits. There are metaphorical but striking expressions on some clay tablets suggesting that some Ashipu tried to pull the spirits of the dead into the physical world by using the bodies of slaves as temporary vessels. The flesh was his, but the breath blew from another place. These shamans were seen as both sacred and dangerous within the social hierarchy. Their power was so terrifying to the public that in some cities they were specially isolated and forbidden from having contact with ordinary people. And at this point, shamanism in Mesopotamia became the art of generating power from slavery. So how did they learn this dark knowledge? Was the answer with the gods who were their teachers, or was it a much older, now forgotten, tradition? The most striking clues about the existence of shaman-like figures in Mesopotamia come from ritual structures and buried objects. Archaeological excavations, especially in the cities of Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, have revealed areas that are quite different from ordinary temples. The first notable feature in these structures is the blood channels. Special channels were carved into the stone floors that did not flow outward but converged inward. According to experts, these channels were made to collect sacrificial blood and perhaps reuse it. This aligns with the belief in the cyclical use of sacred fluid seen in shamanic rituals. Another striking find is the dark rooms. These rooms, with no entrances or windows and a single light source from an opening in the ceiling, contained obsidian mirrors, animal bones, lead tablets, and stones adorned with unknown symbols. Some researchers suggest these areas were used for trance induction, spirit summoning, or mind manipulation. One of the strangest finds in these areas is masks of mixed human and animal features. These masks may have been symbolic tools worn by the shaman when they assumed their spirit form. Because most of the masks were found near slave graves, some researchers think these rituals may have been performed to transform the slave's soul or reinforce obedience. Additionally, the Namtar Kispu, Wind of the Dead, ritual mentioned on some clay tablets contains a notable detail. In this ritual, the spirits of the dead were summoned on certain nights, but it was believed they could only speak through a body that had dedicated itself. This dedicated body was often a person of slave status. Such practices suggest that slaves in Mesopotamia were used not just as physical labor but as ritual and metaphysical tools. And at the center of all these rituals is one thing: control. A way to keep society in order, enveloped in fear and mystery. In ancient Mesopotamia, religion was not just a belief system, it was a political tool. The main reason shamanic rituals were so effective in slave societies was that they were intertwined with authority. Kings and rulers were seen as the representatives of the gods on earth. But this authority had to be constantly renewed, and this is where rituals came into play. The public, especially the slaves, was conditioned to constantly submit to the power from above by participating in or witnessing these rituals. For example, in Babylon, the New Year festival, Akitu, was not just a celebration but a ceremony of re-establishing authority. In this ceremony, the king was symbolically humiliated in front of the people, then entered the temple to establish a union with the gods. Afterward, he would regain his power. This cycle would renew the people's faith in the king's divine legitimacy. But there were also more secret and dark rituals. The Sherpu ritual involved the punishment of a person, or slave, for their sins. Sometimes, it did not even matter if they had actually committed those sins. What mattered was that the public witnessed this punishment. This way, the system appeared to be a force that maintained moral and cosmic order. Another method was to create loyalty through fear. Curse rituals carved on lead tablets were used to prevent betrayal by slaves. A slave who harmed their master would be told that their soul would be torn apart by the dark gods. Such spells were constantly reminded to not just the slaves but also the lower classes of society. The common point of these rituals: they were mechanisms of control. When fear, mystery, and sacredness came together, they created a force of pressure stronger than the tightest chains. And at the center of this entire dark structure was an unseen but felt figure, the shaman. They were an intermediary who spoke with the gods, initiated punishment, spoke the curse, and was the guardian of order. But were shamans truly just a belief, or were they the system's most terrifying weapon? Throughout history, the shaman figure has played a role not only as a spiritual guide or healer but also as the system's shadow eye. In ancient slave societies, these figures created an invisible domain of power that affected the fate of the people. Shamans held an untouchable status due to the belief that they could speak with gods, communicate with spirits, and see the unseen. But this status also made them dangerous. Because a shaman didn't just heal, they could cast curses, summon disaster, and punish disobedience. Especially in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and some African slave societies, the influence of shamans was as strategic as secret intelligence. Who would get sick, who would suffer the wrath of the gods, who would be sacrificed? Some of this was linked to mystic rituals, but behind it were often political calculations. Slaves, the most vulnerable part of society, were at the center of this shamanic fear. For them, every bad event could be the result of a curse from above, and every act of disobedience was seen as a sin echoing in the world of spirits. Thus, the shaman would become both the voice of God and the shadow of the master. In some rituals led by the shaman, slaves would be put into a trance, forced to confess, or subjected to violent practices to have the evil spirits removed from them. This was not a collective cleansing but a tactic of intimidation. Historians say that shamans eventually became one of the most powerful tools of authority. Being unquestionable made them almost an extension of the gods in the eyes of the public. This situation served the interests of the rulers, making both control and obedience sustainable. But were shamans truly just a part of authority? Or did they sometimes become independent spiritual leaders who rebelled against the system and forged their own path? Not every shaman was a servant of authority. Some emerged as a symbol of silent but powerful resistance, as the spiritual leaders of the slaves, the oppressed, and the outcasts. For them, ritual was not just a religious practice but the language of resistance. For example, in some indigenous communities in South America, shamans who emerged among the enslaved people were the forerunners of a spiritual uprising against the religion and order imposed by European colonizers. Their ceremonies were less about summoning spirits and more about the act of reclaiming and remembering identity. In some African tribes, shamans who resisted the pressure of slave hunters would lead their people into the forests, perform protective rituals there, and establish new, independent communities. Sometimes, rumors would spread that they fought back against masters with magic, which increased their mystic power. These figures were people who managed both the fears and hopes of their people. For them, spiritual freedom was stronger than physical chains. Some historians say that the practices of these shamans contributed to the emergence of secret communities and the triggering of slave rebellions. Of course, the system made special efforts to suppress such dangerous shamans. Rituals were forbidden, sacred objects were burned, and shamans were declared to be in league with the devil in the eyes of the public. But this suppression, instead of silencing them, turned them into legends. As we've seen in this section, the shaman figure was not always a tool of control. Sometimes, they were a key trying to break the chains. There was a silent but deep rebellion with a mystic language. And this language, every time it was forbidden, began to be whispered by more and more people. At the heart of ancient shamanic rituals were not just words or prayers, but also ritual objects full of symbols. These objects might have looked simple, but each one was a key to a great power with the meaning it carried, and often became the nightmare of slave owners and rulers. In some civilizations, stone masks, bone talismans, and necklaces made from animal claws were used for spirit summoning or breaking spells. But these objects were not just spiritual, they were also a symbol of resistance. Because for enslaved people, these objects were a way to remember their lost identities. For example, animal tooth necklaces seen on the necks of some slaves in ancient Mesopotamia were seen by masters as primitive ornaments, but these necklaces were actually magical objects believed to carry the souls of ancestors. Similarly, figurines made of mud used in Central Africa were used for both magic and secret communication. The reason these objects were considered forbidden was not just religious but also political. Because the rulers knew that as long as a people held on to their own symbols, they could not be completely subjugated. Ritual knives, obsidian mirrors, incense sticks, musical instruments made from animal bones. Each was a message. This message was sometimes a protective spell, sometimes a call to resistance, and sometimes a silent testimony left for the future. And today, the reactions of archaeologists when they encounter these objects are still noteworthy. Sometimes they pass them off as ordinary items, other times the symbols on them make them think for hours. Because these objects carry not only the mystic but also the political memory of the past. The shamans of history and their forbidden rituals did not just remain on the dusty shelves of the past. Their spirit continues to echo in today's modern world, in societies struggling with unseen chains. Physical slavery may have been abolished in the 21st century, however, economic, psychological, and social slavery still affects billions of people. This is why the themes of liberation, reclaiming your soul, and remembering the sacred self from ancient shamanic traditions are being revived. Ritual dances still performed in some parts of Africa, the ayahuasca ceremonies of Amazon tribes in South America, shamanic circles in Siberia. All these practices are modern manifestations of the spiritual uprising from ancient times. And interestingly, those who turn to these practices are no longer just indigenous communities, individuals living in metropolises, who have lost the meaning of their lives and are trapped in the system, are also embracing this ancient wisdom. Because these rituals remind people not only of a past, but also of a future in which they can be free. The shamans in ancient slave societies were figures who secretly sang hymns in the dark, and saved their people in their dreams. They were the spiritual leaders of a people physically chained. Today, these figures find life in trauma therapists, spiritual guides, or ordinary people embarking on an inner journey. But this should not be forgotten, these old rituals are not just objects of mystic curiosity. They are a field of memory. They are an attempt to give a voice to lost languages, suppressed identities, and silenced stories. And in this sense, they are still seen as a threat today. The shamans who were once forbidden are speaking again today. The whispers are now being heard more loudly. And as we continue to tell these stories, those whispers may one day turn into a scream of freedom.